Right? Okay, very good. So, my name is Paul DuCett, and I teach at a high school in New York City. And this is the fourth time I've attended Langfest, but the second time that I've presented. And my topic today is the place of elitism, if there is one, in the modern language classroom. Uh, One of my fears today is that I'm going to bring up a lot of problems, and I may not have many solutions, but at least to give us uh, a lot of food for thought. Okay, so about me, I've been studying languages for over 40 years, and I've been teaching languages for about 25. I've taught, my native language is English. I'm originally from Boston. Now I live in New York City. I studied in the public schools, French and Spanish, studied in university and graduate school, Russian, Latin, ancient Greek, Chinese. By self-study with technology, meetups, etc., I've studied some German, Italian, Polish, Japanese, modern Greek. So lots of things keep on changing what I'm doing. Okay, let me move this here. Okay, so my experience in teaching languages, I've taught English and Latin in adult education programs. I've taught Spanish and Russian in university credit programs. Abroad, I taught in a Fulbright Award in English in Russia, and also in the New York Public School, I've taught Spanish, French, and Russian. Okay, so my opening anecdote. Okay, the Finns, the people from Finland, have the most effective teaching system in the world. They arrived at it by accident. They were not trying to create the most fair, the most equitable system in the world. It just ended up being, they found the most equitable way, and also turned it out to be really, really good. So the inherent message seems to be that fair equals good, fairer is better, and the fairest is the best. So that is our question, like, is teaching language fair? Is it equitable, or is it just snotty and elitist? Okay? So background to this talk. When I spoke at Langfest 2 years ago, I spoke of how there was a revolution in language acquisition theory, the nearly universal agreement that one acquires language through comprehensive input is called the input hypothesis, which had been going on for about the last 50 years, but was mostly being trivialized in the actual practice in the public school. It's like this revolution had happened, and most teachers didn't notice it. I was aware of the opinion that our enthusiastic polyglot community, the bloggers, the YouTubers, the meetuppers, etc., they were not also very aware of this. That's what I thought 2 years ago. And they were not aware of this fundamental shift away from the general grammar plus vocabulary plus practice equals fluency paradigm. I open up things every day to study new languages, and I say, well, this is the formula. So it's very, very stubborn. Since then, happily, especially since we had Dr. Stephen Krashen, the foremost advocate for the input hypothesis of language acquisition, when we had him here at Langfest 2 years ago, I saw a big shift. Things have changed. I see now that many of their bloggers, YouTubers, attendees of meetups, etc., have turned to producing videos and text of comprehensible input, that they are adopting this more natural and effective approach to acquiring language and fostering the acquisition of language. So congratulations to you people. The revolution is reaching you. Unfortunately, right, in the public schools, in the universities, less. Okay, because our community has made this progress, today I'm going to talk only briefly about the fundamentals of learning and teaching with comprehensive input, because you know it more or less, which the research shows is the only genuinely effective way to acquire languages. Instead, I'm going to discuss one serious consequence of not adopting comprehensible input approach, and that is the alienation and the discouragement and outright discrimination against the vast majority of those who would acquire a second language. It really reminds me of apartheid in South Africa. Like 95% of people do not learn well by memorize the vocabulary, memorize the grammar, apply it. Only about 5% of us learn well that way, and we become teachers, and we promulgate that process. So it is this elitism, teaching only to a selective few in language teaching, that I will discuss. Okay, so just to review, so the difference between learning and acquiring a language. Learning a language is conscious. You know you're memorizing. It is the abstract, forced memorization of rules and vocabulary. In applying these, no easy task, to new communication. As the concepts and vocabulary are learned mostly superficially, they are easy to forget. And you have to plan the order in which you learn the elements. This is the old school learning a language. Now, what most universities, most departments of linguistics are fostering is acquiring a language. Acquiring a language is unconscious. We all did it when we learned our native languages. If we were young enough when we started learning non-native languages, we were doing it as young people. As adults, it's a little harder, but it can still be done. Acquiring a language comes out naturally. You don't even know why or how you know this thing. It comes from repeated and varied exposure. If you are exposed to some elements of language over and over again in different contexts, it will stick to you. I'll give you an example off the top of my head. I teach Spanish in the public schools, and the administrators of my school are often pushing me to speak only Spanish in the classroom, which is a little bit hard for me because I'm a little bit old school too, but I'm doing it more and more. So I had this class in which I was speaking everything in Spanish, and I was constantly checking whether they understood. I'm saying, ¿entiendes? ¿Entiendes? Blah, blah, blah. ¿Entiendes? ¿Entiendes? I had some students come back to me on the second day of class and say, Mr. DuCett, I was dreaming ¿entiendes last night. That word entiende, that's what language acquisition is. If you keep on repeating in different contexts, people will get it, despite whatever their mind is doing. So anyway, it becomes part of you and something that you'll very likely forget. This person, I don't know whether she ever learned anything else in Spanish, but to this day, I'm sure she knows ¿entiendes? ¿Entiendes? You can't acquire a new element of language until you're ready. This is one of the most interesting things about teaching through a textbook, is that the textbook says, in chapter 14, you will learn present subjunctive. And the kid might not be ready for it. And you can teach and teach and teach. Some of them, that 5% of people who like to learn through grammar and rules, they'll get it. And the other 95, until they're ready for it, it's just not going to happen. Okay, so how students actually acquire language, they hear and they read content that due to the context or some other instructional aids, they understand. They internalize what they hear and they read. I like that word, internalize. It's not the same as learn. They kind of internalize it. This is gradual. Many different repetitions with many different variations are necessary. One cannot predict which elements of the language will stick or be acquired first. Some errors will persist a long time. This is called transitional language, which should be encouraged. With persistent exposure to comprehensible input, these errors will disappear. And you know what? Even if certain errors persist forever, you're still a person speaking rather than doing nothing. You know, people who I'm sure we've all heard about, I studied X language for 15 years or 5 years or 3 years, but I can't say anything. That's impossible if you're being taught constantly exposure. Okay, so this is just the background. So the 4 topics of this talk, I'm going to talk about the seductive idea of elitism in language study. I'm going to talk about the negative concepts of elitism in language teaching. And I'm going to talk about a little bit what alternatives we can propose to elitist language teaching. And if there's time, we can talk about, are there ways to combine elitist teaching approaches with more egalitarian approaches? So what is elitism? Elitism is getting the smallest number of people to achieve the highest results. It is, by its very, very nature, an exclusionary process. It's like, you guys are the best. You scored the highest on this test. I'm going to put you in this special class. The rest of you, I hope the teacher does something with you. Okay. Examples of elitism in the world: the Olympic athletes and other world champions, concert pianists, top-rated surgeons, simultaneous interpreters at the United Nations or other. I think these are like the elite of some of our language learners. So I'm going to argue, well, actually, probably it's on the next one. So elitism in language teaching. There are classes in which language teaching is reserved for only the best. There are advancement placement classes, AP in schools. There are highly competitive admissions requires for programs for interpretation, Monterey Institute in the United States, for example. Language programs in which the standards are held so high that most students drop out, leaving only a select few to become majors. This is what happened to me when I was at Middleburg College in the United States. I studied Russian. My first semester, we had 40. By the end of the 4 years, there were 8 of us left, and we were all majors. You know? But we were very good. But there were some other people who went on to be really, really good linguists with other languages, but there's something about that Middlebury Russian method, they just couldn't deal with it. And so that's the thing I'm going to argue, is that sometimes these methods, although it does produce stars, it has to discard people along the way to get the stars. So why is elitism supported in many spheres? One is they have this perceived need. One wants one's doctor to be the very best. I agree. One wants Olympic athletes to be at the top of their field. One wants a concert pianist to have superior skills. One wants one's interpreter to get the translation right. There are instances in life when I think that a certain amount of elitism may be necessary. You can argue with me, but I think sometimes the seductive case for, so the popular philosophy is the better students won't be held back by the lower performing students. Now, this is happening in the school that I'm teaching in. When I started teaching there was only like one kind of Spanish class. We argued all of our Spanish classes are elite. All of our students are wonderful. I don't know whether that was true or not. Then we got a new dean of languages, and he decided to put an honors class in. And I think the reason why he did that is he wants some award winners. He wants to be able to put in some brochures that our students won this award. So we have this track where they're honor students, and I teach the other track. And some of my students, I think, could also be honor students, but they just missed one question too many on that first test, and so they're out of the honors program. Okay, the justification. Can you still hear me? Yeah. The justification of elitism. One justification of elitism is based on the theory of meritocracy, that some people work harder than others, and thus they deserve to achieve more. They deserve their more exclusive circles of success. I have some sympathy for it, but there's so many holes to that argument. Another justification of elitism is natural inequality. I guess some people are less gifted in some areas than others. It is only natural that some people achieve more than others. This is a very popular idea. Oh. Elitism is rejected or ignored in situations in which the general participation is encouraged. Expertise is not required. For example, if you want to play a sport, you don't want to necessarily be on the Olympic level. You want to learn a language. You don't necessarily want to be an interpreter at the UN. So there is sympathy for this argument. It is a common occurrence that in language classes, there are students of different levels struggling to do the same thing. I'm a teacher. It is difficult. And if you're teaching with traditional methods, usually the students who don't understand the grammar, who didn't memorize the vocabulary, are never going to catch up to those students who do that easily. The teacher has difficulty finding the correct level to teach on. The teacher ends up favoring the better students, or sometimes they favor the worst students, or sometimes they just find some middle standard, and very few people, if anyone, is satisfied. So teaching is difficult. Often in these situations, almost no one is taught on their level, and no one learns very much. This is one of the sources of teacher frustration and burnout. It is a very, very real thing. Now, there are ways out of it, but the problem is not many schools are doing it, okay? So negative consequences of elitism, I think is already obvious. You know, they can discourage people. Only a small minority of people find exclusion and losing in competition to be motivating. There are some people like, oh, correct me all the time. It'll make me strive to be better. Most people don't function like that. If I correct you all the time, you'll quit. You'll hate me. So we have to rethink some of our philosophies. When is elitism considered excessive? Here's some ideas. When no one but the best are allowed to play sports. When no one but the best are allowed to play musical instruments. Imagine if the society was like that. It already is a little bit, but no one but the best singers are allowed to sing karaoke. Karaoke would never survive. Right, we have some karaokeers in the audience. In any field endeavor in which people would like to participate, but with no expectation of becoming the best, there is an awful lot of non-elite great stuff going on in life. Maybe the foreign language classroom should be one of them. We'll see. So how does elitism in the foreign language teaching? So the teacher focuses on some more difficult learning skills, like memorization of grammar rules, to the exclusion of others. I spelled exclusion wrong, sorry. Little credit is given for imperfectly formed speaking or writing in the target language. This is very, very frustrating because language should be gradual, and you gradually go from a very imperfect language to a little bit more perfect along. When I read a sentence and I say 0 credit, you know, I have a Chinese teacher friend of mine, and she says, when you write a character, if you get 1 strike wrong, 0 credit. I can imagine how motivating that is for her students. The Chinese classes get smaller and smaller every year, okay? Inordinate emphasis is placed on small details of language, spelling rules, accent marks, exceptions to rules, rather than on the gradual acquisition of comprehension and eventually expression in language. Now, The point that I'm slowly making is that there are two kinds of elitism. There's a kind when we just assume that some are better than others and we put them in other classrooms on purpose. And then there's the other kind of elitism that just using the system of memorization, that in itself is elitist because about 95% of people don't learn well that way. So I think I've pretty much said it. So some students are encouraged to study easier classes. Some students are tracked into easier sections. Some students are deemed bad at learning languages, and there's no real evidence. So a lot of people are excluded from the process of teaching languages. Avoiding the bad students. This is something that I see. There's also an elitism among teachers. I teach the honors class. You know, a lot of teachers, they make it their life work. They want to get out of teaching the people who really need to be taught, which is shameful, you know. I have to say, I know some teachers who are just the opposite, and to me, those are the heroes. It's like, my favorite students are the ones who learn the most easily. That's like the challenge. They love that. Those are my heroes, okay? So there's just this thing. They want to have their select classes, their creme de la creme students, just another way to say to avoid the bad students, and that is a problem in the teaching discipline. So the worst part of elitism, I think I've pretty much said this, that some people feel less capable, some people don't deserve to learn languages as much as that. That's a very, very dangerous idea. I mean, in case I haven't said it already, I think that you know that my opinion is everyone can learn languages, everyone deserves to learn languages. Everyone, even if you have learning disabilities, anyone can learn language. We're hardwired as human beings to learn language. So why are students prejudiced against some people who exhibit inaccurate spelling or non-standard grammar? They're pushed out of the elite class. Students who do not exhibit ability to memorize quickly, they're put into the lower class. Or maybe you don't have to take language. Students who do not easily learn grammar rules, they don't apply it. People who got low grades on their other subjects, oh, your scores in math are bad, your score in, you can't learn language, and yet they have nothing to do with each other. Language is a very special process. It's not even really a subject, it's a skill, it's something that we're hardwired to do. Consequences. Most students become discouraged at the abstract and practical tasks, and they never learn them. Moving on. So where do they, I think I've already said memorizing, I'm repeating myself. Oh, why, after 50 years of research in this language exercise, why do these antiquated ideas still persist? And the reason why is because about 5% of language learners, and I admit I'm one of them, we enjoy grammar. We enjoy lists. I'm happy as a clam. Give me my list to memorize. I like philosophizing about it. But that has very little to do with actually speaking, very little to do with actually. So, and because the 5% get to become teachers, because I got an A in Spanish in high school. I got the Spanish award in high school. I went on to become a Spanish teacher, you know. So most people become, they enjoy the abstract side of learning. And so these teachers believe that if they try harder, that if the students try harder, that by memorizing grammar and vocabulary, that they will eventually be successful. So some people just, hang on, it can be done. I did it. So-and-so else did it. But we're not all the same. We don't all think the same. So why, I think I've already said this. The elite things, I want to get to something else, okay? Why does okay, here's where I really. So the truth is that human beings are hardwired to learn language. We are language learning machines. How it exactly works, it's hard to say. There have been 50 years of research, but it seems that we learn just by imbibing what we're exposed to. We're exposed to it, we're exposed to it, and eventually, so the natural way we learn is through taking in messages that surround us, and we internalize them. No student, regardless of academic background or even learning disability, is capable of learning language, and that's really something fascinating. There have been some studies done. There have been schools, mostly elementary school and junior high schools, not high schools, for reasons I could get into later, where students are learning through this input method, and sometimes the English teacher who's teaching traditional methods will notice that little Johnny, whose native language is English, he's writing in better Spanish than he's writing in English. What are you guys doing in the foreign language department? They're finding that this methodology of giving people, reading, exposing them to content is actually more potent, even for developmentally challenged students, than trying. But I explained that grammar rule to you 50 times. We went over this. I have a story coming up. It'll come. So since learning is part of our human nature, it's literally part of our nature, not the same as learning other subjects. Previous academic experience has nothing to do with it, unless you teach language in an abstract, indirect, complicated way. So obviously, my grade in Spanish 1 will affect what happened. Okay, you can still hear me? Okay. My grade in Spanish 1 or my grade in French 2 might predict how I'm going to do in Russian 4 if the way that I'm being taught is the same method. But if you're being taught in different methods, then one grade in one language, one class has nothing to do with anything else. So false ideas. So the shame of it all. Language teaching the way is only an interesting, a small proportion. This is a shame because of all fields of endeavor, learning languages has the potential to be the most joyous, the most inclusive, the most empowering learning process possible. So we need to abandon methodologies that repel students, which make them feel unaccomplished, and which make them quit pursuing their very human and natural capability of learning languages. I'm looking at my watch. So the advantage of the CI approach. CI is comprehensive input, comprehensible input, right. So if you take the comprehensible input method, which essentially is drowning them in content. Really, it's listening first. It's learning how to understand first. As you begin to understand, then you will be tempted to start speaking. It's almost like you can't keep it in you because it's inside you. With the CI teaching, all the students, not just the elite students, will be able to learn. There'll be less equity among racial or ethnic lines because learning through stories and oral histories is a universal teaching method, not just for the rich communities or the technologically developed countries. I've seen this where I teach. I teach in New York City. And in New York City, I have a lot of rich students who tend to be white, and I have a lot of immigrant students from all over the world who tend not to be. And my students who are not the white rich kids from Brooklyn tend to really respond to stories and singing. They just love it. And the students who went through first, second, third, because I teach 9th and 10th grade, the students who for the first 8 years of their education were taught that it was important to memorize these words and to play these word games where they change the form, because they become good at that game of changing the form and doing their homework. I have students who do their homework who don't know what they did, but they got all the answers right because they just learned how to flick, change the O to A. It's not communicating. Students who didn't grow up with 8 years of that, they're like, what is this? They don't like it, okay? Anyway, the alternative to elitism. So the obvious is to the comprehensible input, more effective, I've been saying this, does not require one to artificially construct language based on abstract notions. That's probably the thing. If you teach students abstract thought, then they're going to end up with abstract thought. Learning a language, while there are some abstract elements to it, we don't acquire it in an abstract way. We acquire it in a concrete way. The reason why we know words is because somebody said them to us at a specific time in a specific pattern. Like I said, it's only about 5% of us who enjoy sort of the abstract part of learning. And many, many traditional teachers, they spend 95% of the classroom doing abstract things like, oh, the beauty of the subjunctive, is it? You'll see. So real learning, comprehensive input, it operates on an unconscious level, and it's based on concrete, varied repetitions. And if the student is exposed to them, it will effortlessly, or almost effortlessly, imprint themselves onto the student's brain. I tell my students, you don't have to do a lot of homework in Spanish class if you listen during the class. Even if you're not very active, if you listen actively, you can get so much. So, advantage of the approach, okay, non-exclusionary classroom, I've mentioned that. Other ideas to foster a non-exclusionary effective classroom. So have students track their own progress. We have to find ways to break out of this, everyone's doing exactly the same thing. Everybody's learning the exact same thing because it's very frustrating for almost everybody. Have students compete with each other in groups, not as individuals. That's something I found very interesting. When you break up the class into little groups, I love competing. But if you make it personal, you compete against him. You stand up and say the sentence in front of the whole class. If they make a mistake, they're horrified. Individual competition may lead to discouragement of the losers, where students are motivated, oops, I forgot the D, by belonging to a group, especially in competition with other groups. Should one include? Yes. Okay, this is my fourth topic. So the question is, since I believe in my heart and through the research that really the comprehensive input method is the way, then why am I even talking about maybe throwing in some traditional practices? The reason why is if one wants to keep one's job, the kids expect it. The parents expect it. They want to see those grammar rules. They want to see those vocabulary lists, so there are ways to do it. Okay? So eventually, I hope that these more exclusionary, grammar-centered language practices die out. But in the present day, these practices enjoy prestige. That's what it is, prestige, with many teachers, many administrators, many parents, and even the students themselves. There are kids who are like, what is this storytelling thing? Where are our verb lists? You know, when I was in 8th grade, honors, Spanish, they gave us verb lists, and they'll complain to their parents. Oh, this is so therefore, it might be considered too revolutionary not to include vocabulary lists, grammar rules, etc. And by doing so, it could threaten a teacher's employment. It's a real thing. So you can combine approaches. For the foreseeable future, there will always be students in the class who expect and demand more traditional methods. They may well complain to their parents or administration if the methods used in class are very unfamiliar to them. It may be helpful to have some limited traditional or elitist methods available to them so they feel comfortable. Here, take this grammar book. Here, take this list. Here, I'll put the rule on the board. You know. So the great divide in the classrooms. There, again, 95% of them, the people who enjoy grammar learning, and then those who would rather not, for 95%. Again, I've said this again, I said this again. My problem with presentation, sometimes I'm too thorough. Students have never had languages before. Right, if a student has never had a language instruction before, and they've never even studied their own language from a grammatical, analytic point of view, those students will find learning a language through vocabulary lists and grammar rules to be very, very difficult. And this is something I found interesting. Some students fool themselves. Every semester I have students who are good at grammar games. I call them grammar games, which is not the same thing as acquiring a language. Homework assignments which accompany our textbook are grammatical games for them. They change this form to that form, from present to past, for example, and they complete the sentence. I have students who do this. They get 100% on the homework, and then in communication, they can't do the difference between present and past tense. They do very well on these exercises, but it doesn't necessarily translate into doing well. For that reason, I try to keep this kind of transform the grammar exercises to a minimum. A little bit, so some people feel comfortable, but not too much. Every semester I also have, and lately more and more, because my school is accepting more and more students with learning disabilities, I have the opposite type of student. It's very, very interesting. If you give them a convert the following verb from present to past tense kind of exercise, they will get none of it right. They have no idea what this game is. Again, if you've been doing it for 8 years in your elite school, you're good at it. But if you come from another culture, another background, another kind of school, like, what is this? Those students, on the other hand, when I give them examples of stories in the past tense, dictations in the past tense, comments on my own life in the past tense, on more open format activities such as writing a composition, they will write more successful in the past tense than any of the other students. So I've never seen this before, but it's only happened in the last few years that, again, it fascinates me that they will get none of the homework that I've assigned because I have a very traditional textbook required by my school. They'll get none of the homework right, and then they'll get it right in real situations. So I'm counting the homework less and less. Sometimes the difference between the two students are obvious. I had a student, one of my students I love this student because it's so real. She would literally fall asleep in class. Anytime I used a grammatical word that's a conjugation indicative, she would fall asleep. And it's interesting, if you do more research in this comprehensive input methodology, they say that you should take a student, you call him or her the monitor student. It's usually the student who is the worst student in grammar-based things. If that student is getting it, then the class is going well. If he or she can get it, then everyone can get it. Well, she's totally my monitor student because she falls asleep. But the very same student would come alive and be the most participating student in the class if I ever used a content, if I were singing a song or if I were telling a story with rhythmical repetitions, she'd be like doing it. It's really, really great. So how to keep both types of learners happy in the classroom? So I would say teach mainly through comprehensive input. Make sure that the students are exposed to content in what you want them to learn multiple times and with multiple variations. Pass out occasional vocabulary sheets and grammar rules. Those who want to read these and memorize them, they can. Those who can't understand it, don't. I'm really passing it out for their parents, honestly. But don't make the students' memorization of abstract rules the center of your class. It is a supplementary measure for those who crave that kind of abstract learning. Again, you can't have them complaining to your parents that Mr. DuCett doesn't teach grammar. There'll be complaints all over the place. Other ways, so put the grammar-centered question on the test as extra credit. That's not something I do. Make sure the lion's share of your test are based on what the students acquire through exposure. Answer all grammar questions quickly and completely, so as not to switch the focus of the class from content to theory. This is called, what do they call it? Flash grammar. Here's an example. Here's an example of flash grammar. So I will be writing or I'll be saying in Spanish, es importante que los estudiantes lean los libros. For those of you who know grammar, lean is subjunctive. So I'll have a student ask, why is it lean and not leen? Like we learned to conjugate the verb. It's an ER verb, right? And I'll say, okay, I switched the E to an A here because I'm using a different tense. It's called present subjunctive. It's used in sentences when I'm talking about action that's less concrete and abstract. We'll be seeing much more of this later. Move on. Move on. Satisfy that kid's curiosity and move on. Again, you don't want the complaints from the parents. Mr. DuCett doesn't explain grammar. I ask him a question, he doesn't answer. There are teachers who do that, they get into trouble. So more suggestions. Require that students learn a particular skill, not a particular vocabulary. For example, I'm doing that now. The vocabulary list that they give us for my traditional method book, it's just too long. People cannot learn 20, 30, 40 vocabulary words. For example, there's a chapter called Adjectives of Condition Used with Estar. And they have all these different moods that you can be in. I'm frustrated, I'm happy, I'm this, I'm that. So what I'll do, instead of making the vocabulary the focus, I'll say, you all have to be able to tell me how you feel at a particular moment. And I'll go over the ones that they like. Frustrated, unhappy, stressed, but sometimes happy, excited. And I'll teach lots of them, but my requirement is that you can use 3 or 4 of them. Not that you know all of them. You know, the important thing is a skill. Do you know how to react if I ask ¿Cómo estás? If you can, then you learn something. But I don't need, oh, you don't know how to say frustrated, do you? You don't know how to say disappointed. You don't know how to say flummoxed. My closing anecdote. Okay, remember I told you the anecdote at the beginning? This is like the bookend. So remember I told you at the beginning of the talk that the Finns came up with the most effective system of teaching because they were searching for the fairest, most equitable system. Researchers in language acquisition theory and in teaching methodologies have done the opposite. They have worked for decades to find the most effective, the most natural language teaching approach possible, and in doing so, they accidentally found the most equitable, the most least exclusionary way of teaching a language, a way that will empower and not discover students. And that's pretty much my formal end. Actually, this is good. So if people have questions, I have other things to say in case. Thank you. Yes? Thank you.
Okay, great talk, Paul. As I listened to this, it made me think about our Canadian experience, which has been going on for how many years now? I think it was an experiment, but it's now an experience and I'm glad to have Steve Kaufman sitting next to me, and that is our French immersion.
Mm-hmm.
And what is the essence of French immersion is that we're not teaching French, we're teaching in French.
Exactly.
Of course, and how does it work? Is that the early years, well, the various formula. There's early immersion and various partial immersion. I don't know myself. But the idea is that we're teaching in the language and we're not teaching the language.
Yep.
And it works very well. It's very popular.
We have
Now-
programs like that in New York City too.
Yeah.
They're called dual language programs. And what they have is like on every even day they speak English and every odd day they speak the other language. And so people end up after years of being in the system being pretty fluent in both.
Exactly,
Mhm.
exactly. And as a matter of fact, I was in Mexico last year, and I was in the area where I was, and there were all these bilingual schools, and I was really impressed. And I found out these were schools where, elementary schools, where in some high schools, middle schools, and so forth, where everything was in Spanish and in English. So all of that works.
Mhm.
So, but the problem, I think, Paul, and you haven't addressed this, and of course, I understand, is the problem of adults.
The problem of the adults.
Of adults.
Oh,
you
yeah.
know?
Mhm.
Yeah. When they are learning languages,
Mhm.
because there it's a whole other problem. And of course, we know one of the biggest factors and the difficulties of adults learning languages is the presence of the native language.
Mhm.
Something that is less of a problem with kids. So my question to you, Paul, is, what do you think about when, coming from your viewpoint, what do we do with adults?
You mean to make them learn or to let their kids learn?
No, for learning.
Like I said, I mean, there's so much you can say about it. Adults, being adults, are more embarrassed when they make mistakes. Kids have no. I'll give you an example of me. The very first time I came to Montreal was when I was 7 years old in 1967 to see the World's Fair. I was sitting in the back of my car. We were driving from Boston, and I had heard that in Canada they speak this language called French, and I decided I wanted to learn it. So I made my mother buy me this book, and I was reading it in the back. And when I got here, I was 7 years old. I had no shame. I read in the book. I'm walking around saying, "Comment allez-vous? Comment vous appelez-vous?" And people were speaking French to me. I had no shame. Now I'm an adult. I have more shame. It takes. I mean, there are tons of things that I can say to adults. You have to learn to appreciate what you're learning. Let go of the shame. I mean, there's so many things you could say, but I think we should maybe take some other questions because we could talk about this forever. Yes.
I'm very curious. What's your advice for dealing with administration? Because I feel like my biggest struggle was with database learning and objectives. So someone else comes into the class, and like with CI, it's like, okay, I want to get them using the language, but it was like for someone else coming from science or math, or most of the administration doesn't have foreign language experience, so they're like, what are you doing?
It's very, very difficult. I think what you have to do is you have to tell them what they're. I'm going to tell you a story that happened to me. So I was learning all about the CI method. I was gung-ho about it. And one of the things that I learned is you have to let students be silent for a while. You have to let them sort of take in the language. So I did this thing that's called, I forget what it's called, revolving, going around. Anyway, I told them a story. I told them a sentence. And then, like I'd say something like, La chica se llama Juana. The girl's name is Juana. So I'd ask you, La chica se llama Juana or Maria? And all you have to do is say, Juana, to show me you understood. La chica se llama Juana o se llama Juan? Es una chica o es un chico? And you basically, I just have to engage you to think, to check and see if you're understanding. And then later on, you're absorbing it. I had some administrators walk in because the administration policy, it's always surprise visit. They never tell you they're coming. And they told me the teacher was doing too much of the work. The kids weren't speaking, low grade. And I spoke to the students after it. I said, did you feel like you were doing nothing in that class? No, our brains were working very hard to follow what you were saying. I said, that's where language acquisition happens. So I think it's a really big public relations thing you have to do. You have to, if you can get your administrators to go to some kind of comprehensive input seminar, and I noticed that they always make the price for administrators much cheaper than for teachers because they want the administrators to come. Talk to parents. Like I said, there's a whole field that says language should be taught this way, and there's a whole tradition that says it shouldn't be, and it's a difficult place. I don't have a great answer for that, but it's hard, and little by little, you have to come up with strategies. Yes, someone else? Yes?
Hello,
Yeah.
sorry. So I found that very interesting, the principle of elitism in itself. I'm coming from a background where I studied in public school because it's a small place and everything, and I had a lot of discussion about elitism, and one of the things that come back is that some people think, obviously, like my point of view is that what you said, we want everybody to go up and help everybody go up, not
Right.
just the like better students.
Exactly.
But some people were arguing that actually by splitting groups into people that are better and people that struggle more, you're helping everybody because the one that struggle more are going to be able to go at their rhythm and blah blah blah. I want to know what you think about it.
Okay, I think that it really depends on the skill of the teacher. There are some teachers who are extremely skilled in having this group work on this, and this group work on that, and this group work on that, and this group work, and keep it all together. It's very, very hard. And you know, if you manage to do that, you will get really, really high scores when they come to evaluate you because they love that. They said, oh, they're teaching out of the box. What I prefer is to do some kind of activity where everyone has to improve. For example, I'm actually writing up my syllabi for the semester that's beginning in 2 weeks. And I'm thinking, how do I keep the good students happy? How do I get the star? And I thought to myself, let's say we're doing a project where we're learning the adjectives that describe us, and so we're describing people. And so we have a assignment. You have to be able to describe your family. By the end of this week, you're going to describe your family. And while you're describing the family, it would be lovely if you know, could use the feminine ones with your mother and the masculine ones with your father. But that can come later if they don't get the grammatical consideration. But then I always have a group of, I'll call them lazy, maybe unmotivated. I always have a group of students who've been studying Spanish since they were like in first grade, and they're just coasting along. They haven't learned anything. I've decided that I'm going to make somewhere between 5 to 10% of the grade of every student. You have to prove to me that you're learning something. If I know that you're one of these students who've had like a million years of Spanish, then I want to see when you write your composition, I want to see some interesting vocabulary. The kid in that, I want him to say flummoxed. I want him to use the hard vocabulary. So I guess what I'm saying is that if you find activities that everybody can move up, like for example, we're talking about describing our families, okay? There's some students who have absolutely no idea how to do it. So if they learn how to say, my father is tall, my mother is nice, you know, my cousin works in a school, whatever they say, then they've made progress. But then the students who already know how to say that, that's the time when I might give them extra vocabulary, because then the parents will love it. But then the risk is the parents will say, you're treating my son or daughter unfairly, you're making them work harder. So you can never really win, but
But sorry, just from an administrative point of view, do you think it's better to split them and different classes? Does it help everybody, or does it just help people that are already at the top?
I personally don't believe it's again, it depends on your goal. So since we're real lovers of the language, I'll be sincere with you. I don't think that all this management putting in small groups is necessarily the best thing, unless they're working on something that they can help each other with. So if you're just like, you know, segregating, that's all bad speaking together. You're not going to learn anything anyway. At least you won't affect the others. It depends on how you do it. That's bad. But it might work to get good grades on the evaluation, which I'm not encouraging you to do. Anybody else?
Hi there.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the talk. It's been insanely fascinating for me. So very quickly, my story is I went through 9 years of French in school, came out basically not being able to speak. I thought I'd never be able to learn another language. Started learning Mandarin in grade 11, and after like, I don't know, something about 2 years of finally trying many different methods, I found comprehensible input. So it's a completely different world from what is taught in schools. And I know I can learn any language that I want to, and I have that belief in myself. But unfortunately, all my friends just believe that I have a knack for it, or I have some magical skill, right? I'm sure everybody in this room gene that's within them.
As if it takes no work.
And so my question is, from a student's perspective, somebody my age, like, how do I get people that know me to believe that they can do it too? Because I have a tough time convincing anybody that they can even learn more than a sentence.
Well, I'll tell you what I did with my sister. I have a sister who's married to an Italian and has all these Italian relatives. And I told her, you should speak a little Italian. It would help you in your marriage. And so I gave her the Pimsleur method, which is you just listen and you repeat, and it says, you know, buongiorno, come stai, and you repeat and repeat. And I said to my sister, if you do this for half an hour a day, it will improve your life. And I even warned her, do not go to your husband asking him for studying advice. He'll resent it, he'll hate you. Just follow. So she did that, and so the relatives came over and she's saying, buongiorno, and she's talking, and her relatives, oh my God, you're learning Italian, this is wonderful. And the one time she asked her husband, father, he's older, excuse me, she asked her husband about why is it il and not la or whatever. He started a fight with, I don't know, I didn't go to school. No, it's like, so with my sister, I showed her that she could do it. Again, if people aren't willing to take a step, then they're never going to be convinced. I mean, people all the time, we talked about this at one of the dinners I was at, everyone says, oh, I would love to speak Spanish. Okay, well, what are you going to do about it? If you're going to do something about it, then they will be convinced. But if they're just never going to do anything about it, you can say, okay, you're right. What can you do? You can't argue with people who don't want to think. Did I say that out loud? Sorry. Anybody else?
I have a question. Hey,
Yes?
all right, Paul. I mostly wanted to ask you about grading.
Oh, big question.
Like, when I was teaching English, I didn't have to grade too much. I just taught to these little brats, and they figured it out. But like, when you're a real teacher, like you, how do you grade if everybody's on a different track and everybody's doing things differently? How do you figure that out?
It's a headache, but you know, over years you develop something. I have decided that I'm not going to give A's to students anymore who don't do any effort. Because I used to give A's to students because they got all the right answers, because after all, they got all the right answers. But I'm thinking, like, I'm going to start leaning on my better students, like, show me you learned some new vocabulary. Show me, you know, like, you want another list of vocabulary? Here are 55 more adjectives. Learn some of them, you know. It's really, really hard. If I had my druthers, you know, I would abolish grades in the foreign language classroom, and I would substitute it that someone would speak and you would tell them what level they are in. Like, for example, if I told you, for example, there's a grading system that was designed by the North American Association of Languages. I forget the exact name. ACTFL? How does it? ACTFL. What is it? American? Whatever. Anyway, ACTFL came up with this like 10-point list. And if I could say on your transcript, when you started in my class, you were level 1 in Spanish. And now, because of your hard work, you're now level 3. Or you worked in this class and you're level 2. You made some progress. You did nothing that I asked all semester. You were a level 1. You are still a level 1. But you could become a level 2 if you do what I ask you to. I really believe in that more than the kinds of grades we have now. But do I give those kind of grades? No, because I'm not allowed. I have to figure out a way that people can get an A, they can get a B, they can get a C. So actually on my syllabus I've written the following. It's all about communication. If you cannot communicate, it's an F. If I ask you, ¿Cómo estás? And you look at me like this, or if I say, ¿Cómo estás? And you tell me what your name is, you know, that's an F. You're not getting the message. If you communicate and it's barely comprehensible, but I see something's getting in, if I say, ¿Cómo estás? And you say, Mi padre está bien. It's like, you're getting there. You understood it, you know, right? That's probably a D. C level would be when you communicate the correct thing, but with great, great difficulty. But still, it's like the transitional language, you're getting, ¿Cómo estás? Bien. That's kind of like a C. Okay. Yeah, I don't know, you could work. And then, like, you know, estoy bien, B. So I'm going to tell my A students, if you want to say, estoy súper bien porque estoy en su clase y porque me gusta todo. That's an A student. You want them to like, you know. So that's what I'm going to try to do, you know. But everything you do when you're in an ingrained system, you know, with parents with their expectations, it's hard. But little by little. Yes?
Hello? Right at the tip, right there. Oh. Well, first of all, thanks for the great presentation and respect for being a dedicated teacher in spite of all the challenges. Actually, I think you kind of asked the question I was going to ask, but I'll try to add to it. I had several years of experience doing ASL teaching. I was just wondering, do you have some days where do you ever experience frustration build up just trying to talk about the concept of comprehensible input? It's almost like you're, whether it be friends, administration, your students asking you, oh, what do you think? And you try to talk to them about these ideas, and it's almost like you're messing with their reality. Like
Yes.
you're speaking, and right away you're like, okay, you're not hearing anything.
It's
saying.
one camp against another, okay? I have done presentations to my faculty body about this, and they go, oh, very interesting. And then nobody does anything about it. We were even asked, see, we're now in the day where you have to write a plan, you have to write a message statement for everything. So I even wrote the message statement for my department. And the reason why I had to do it is because it's required. Check the right. And so I even wrote in the message, we're going to use comprehensible input. It got into our message statement, but no one paid attention. My department, they teach Spanish, Latin, and Chinese. The Chinese teachers teach in an extremely conservative way. It's like there's only one way to teach Chinese. And like I said, my Chinese teacher says, if one stroke is wrong, the character's all wrong. The Latin teachers are obviously teaching, you know, a non-spoken language, so I really don't care what method they use. It doesn't affect me that much. Although there have been communicative methods of teaching Latin. But the Spanish department, which is the biggest department, we're actually changing one faculty member. We're a faculty of 4, and 25% of us are changing. And the new teacher coming in wrote on his in his work, you know, that he was interested in methods of language acquisition. I'm thinking, please, you know. So I'm hoping that he'll come and give, you know, a little bit more direction. So yes, it's difficult. No, they don't listen, or they do listen and they go, that's nice, but they continue to do the same thing. See, the thing is that you probably already know this. Being a teacher is a really hard job. It's a lot of hours, it's a lot of this, and nobody wants to reinvent the wheel. Imagine if you've been working 15, 20 years in this one method, and then have some little pipsqueak come and say, no, you've been doing it wrong, and your teachers were doing it wrong, and their teachers were doing it wrong. It doesn't make you a popular person. You have you tried considering this? Have you tried? So yes, but I think that the best thing is at the point of hire. You want to hire people who know about this. Now, there are some school systems out there, some in Colorado, especially in the Midwest of the United States. A lot of the stuff is happening around Minnesota, those areas. New York City is like behind the times. We're like old-fashioned. And so if any of you want to go to one of these CI conferences in the Midwest of the United States, they have them every year. There's one, I think, next July. You can learn a lot. I wish I could remember the name. I have it on my Facebook. I can look it up for you. Okay. Yes.
Hi. Thank you. And so, like you said, being a teacher is hard. I teach at university, 4-hour classes. How would you plan comprehensible input for 4 hours without the students being brain dead?
4 hours, like in a row.
Yes. We do have.
This is like a once a week. No, this happens. This is the real. See, that's another difficult thing about the language teaching establishment versus how people really learn. Really, people learn a little bit every day. That's the best way. And these long courses. So what I would say is, you'll do a story for 25 minutes or 35 minutes, and you'll have you really want to build some creation time. At some point, break into groups and make up a story. I'll give you the beginning of a story, you know. Xerxes is a dinosaur. You write 9 more sentences. You have to find it a way, you have to change it. Because, again, you do learn from input, but students can also provide input to each other. They'll say, oh, How do you say dinosaur? They'll look it up in the dictionary or something. Again, mix it up. You can't have like one story for 4 hours. That would be too boring. Anybody else? Oh, it's time, I guess. It's 12:13. So thank you very, very much. Thank you.